Welcome to this journey through one of the most fascinating and turbulent periods in human history. Before we delve into the depths of the Viking Age, I ask that you subscribe to this channel, activate the notification bell, and like this video. Your support is essential for us to continue producing high-quality educational content about the great moments in world history. Now, prepare for an epic journey through nearly 3 centuries of conquests, battles, and transformations that shaped the destiny of Europe. The origins of the North Storm, the Viking Age, which spanned approximately 793 to 1066 CE, represents one of the most transformative chapters in medieval European history. This extraordinary period saw the Scandinavian peoples emerge from their frozen lands to become one of the most feared and influential forces in the known world. But to truly understand the Viking Wars, we must first understand who these northern warriors were and what drove them beyond their native fjords. The Vikings were not a single, monolithic people, but rather a designation encompassing the inhabitants of Scandinavia, a region that today corresponds to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The word Viking itself derives from the Old Norse Vikingr, which meant pirate or raider. It is important to emphasize, however, that most Scandinavians of that time were farmers, fishermen, artisans, and merchants. Only a relatively small portion of the population actually participated in the raiding and conquest expeditions that made the Vikings so famous and feared. Pre-Viking Scandinavian society was organized around clans and agricultural communities governed by local chieftains, known as jarls. These communities were relatively isolated, separated by mountain ranges, deep fjords, and vast expanses of forest. Arable land was scarce, especially in Norway, where the mountains of the Scandinavian range left few fertile valleys for cultivation. This scarcity of natural resources, combined with significant population growth during the late 8th century, created pressures that would eventually drive thousands of Scandinavians to seek their fortune overseas. Contemporary historians identify multiple factors that contributed to the beginning of the Viking expansion. The period coincided with the so-called medieval warm period, a relatively favorable climatic phase that extended approximately from 800 to 1300. During this interval, weather conditions in Scandinavia became more stable and predictable. The seas became calmer, and sea ice became less frequent. These climatic conditions facilitated long-distance sea voyages and allowed for more abundant harvests, which in turn sustained the population growth that would put pressure on the carrying capacity of the Scandinavian lands. The proliferation of iron use in Scandinavia during this period also played a key role. The increased agricultural production afforded by more efficient iron tools allowed the population to grow beyond what the land could permanently sustain. As a result, many Scandinavians found themselves without property and without social status. To remedy this situation, these landless men turned to piracy as a means of obtaining material wealth. Another crucial factor was the technological development in Scandinavian shipbuilding. Viking vessels, known as drakers or longships, represented the pinnacle of medieval naval engineering. Built using the clinker construction technique, where wooden planks overlapped like fish scales, these ships combined lightness and strength in an extraordinary way. With their shallow draft, they could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowing surprise attacks on locations far from the coast. Their flexible hulls absorbed the impact of waves, while their symmetrical shape allowed them to advance or retreat quickly without needing to turn. Equipped with rectangular wool sails and rows of oars, they could both cross oceans and maneuver in confined spaces. Historian Anders Winroth categorically stated that if the Scandinavians of the early Middle Ages had not become skilled shipbuilders, there would have been no Vikings and no Viking Age. The Viking expansion was also driven by both internal and external political factors. Internally, Scandinavia was undergoing a period of centralization of power. In Norway, Harald Fairhair was in the process of unifying the various small kingdoms under his rule, forcing hundreds of chieftains and their followers to leave their lands. Many of these displaced men sought refuge and new opportunities in foreign lands, becoming raiders along the coasts of the British Isles and Western Europe. Externally, conditions in Europe favored the Scandinavian invaders. England, Wales, and Ireland were divided into numerous warring kingdoms, in a state of constant internal disorder. The Carolingian Empire, after the death of Charlemagne in 814, fragmented among his heirs, creating opportunities for external invaders. The monasteries and religious centers of Christendom, filled with treasures of gold, silver, and precious stones, represented tempting and practically defenseless targets for warriors from the sea. Some historians also propose that Charlemagne's Saxon Wars, which resulted in the forced conversion of pagan Saxons to Christianity during the late 8th century, may have provoked a defensive and vengeful reaction from pagan Scandinavians against Christians. The beginning of the Viking Age coincides remarkably with these Frankish campaigns against the Germanic pagans, suggesting a possible connection between Christian expansion and Viking raids. The attack on Lindisfarne and the beginning of the Viking Age. The event that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age occurred on June 8, 793, when Norse warriors attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, located on a small island off the northeast coast of England. in what is now Northumberland. This attack was not necessarily the first incident involving Scandinavians in the British Isles. Records indicate that in 789, 3 Norwegian ships from the Hordaland region landed on the Isle of Portland, off the coast of Dorset. A royal official named Beduhard, believing the newcomers to be merchants, approached to escort them to the local lord. The visitors responded by killing the official and his men. This incident, while violent, may have been a trading expedition that ended badly, not necessarily a planned attack. Lindisfarne, however, was different. The attack was deliberate, devastating, and sent shockwaves throughout European Christendom. The monastery of Lindisfarne was one of the most important religious centers in Anglo-Saxon England, founded in 635 by the Irish monk Saint Aidan. It was the resting place of the relics of Saint Cuthbert, one of England's most venerated saints, and housed a monastic community that had produced some of the most magnificent illuminated manuscripts of the time, including the celebrated Lindisfarne Gospels. The island was considered sacred, a place of pilgrimage and learning believed to be under divine protection. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with apocalyptic words, describing terrible omens that preceded the attack, including immense flashes of light streaking across the skies, whirlwinds, and fire-breathing dragons flying through the firmament. These terrible signs, according to the Chronicle, were followed by a great famine, and not long after, the pagans wreaked havoc on God's church on the Holy Isle through pillaging and massacre. The invaders arrived suddenly from the sea. They landed quickly, killed monks, threw others into the sea to drown, and took many as slaves along with the church's treasures. The attack was so shocking that it gave rise to the traditional prayer, A furor normanorum labora nos, Domini, or From the fury of the men of the north, deliver us, Lord. Although this specific prayer has no proven contemporary historical record, the devastation of Lindisfarne was reported by the scholar Alcuin of York, one of the most learned men of his time and advisor to Charlemagne. In a letter to Bishop Higbald of Lindisfarne, Alcuin wrote in horror, "Never before in Britain has such terror appeared as we now suffer at the hands of a pagan race, nor was it thought that such a maritime incursion could be made. Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert, sprinkled with the blood of God's priests, stripped of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than any other in Britain has been given as prey to the pagan peoples." The attack on Lindisfarne established a pattern that would be repeated countless times in the following centuries. Coastal monasteries, laden with riches and inhabited by unarmed men dedicated to prayer, became favorite targets of Viking invaders. In 794, another serious attack was launched against the monastery of Jarrow, also in Northumberland. In the same year, according to the Annals of Ulster, a serious raid was made against Iona, the mother house of Lindisfarne on the west coast of Scotland. Attacks on Iona would continue in 795, 802, and 806, with the 802 attack being particularly devastating, resulting in a great massacre among the Kelly Day Brotherhood and the complete destruction of the abbey by fire. The expansion of attacks and the escalation of the Violence following the attack on Lindisfarne, Viking raids multiplied rapidly. During the first decades of the 9th century, Ireland became the main target of the Norse raiders, while England and the Carolingian Empire managed, to some extent, to resist the invasions. The first records of Viking attacks in Ireland date back to 795, when the island of Recrew, whose exact location has not been identified, was devastated. From then on, conflicts became incessant. Ireland was particularly vulnerable for several reasons. Like England, it was divided into numerous smaller kingdoms in constant conflict with each other. Irish monasteries were renowned for their wealth and the artistic work of their monks. Their jagged coastline offered numerous bays and inlets where Viking ships could dock undetected. Furthermore, the Irish lacked a significant naval tradition that could have challenged Scandinavian fleets. The initial raids were relatively small, conducted by groups of a few ships seeking quick plunder before returning to Scandinavia. However, the scale of operations progressively increased. In 836, according to the Annals of Ulster, a fleet of 60 Viking ships sailed up the River Boyne, and another fleet of similar size entered via the River Liffey. This increase in the scale of operations signaled a fundamental shift in the nature of Viking raids. The Scandinavians were no longer interested solely in seasonal plunder. They were beginning to establish permanent bases in Ireland. In 841, the Vikings established a permanent settlement in Dublin, which would become one of the most important centers of Norse power in the British Isles. Dublin's location was strategically ideal. Situated at the mouth of the River Liffey, it offered access to both the sea and the interior of Ireland. The settlement, known to the Norse as Dyflin, quickly evolved from a winter camp into a thriving trading city, eventually becoming the center of the Kingdom of Dublin, which would exist in various forms until the Norman invasion of 1171. During the following decades, the Vikings established additional settlements in Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. Each of these locations became a center of Norse power, from where the Scandinavians could launch raids into the Irish interior or trade with the local populations. The situation in Ireland was complex and fluid. The Vikings were not a monolithic force. different groups frequently clashed with each other. Irish kings, in turn, did not hesitate to form temporary alliances with Viking groups against their Irish rivals. The result was a period of endemic violence, but also of intense cultural and commercial exchange. Meanwhile, in England, Viking raids remained relatively sporadic until the 840s. Anglo-Saxon resistance was more organized than in Ireland, and the English kingdoms generally managed to repel the initial incursions. However, the situation began to change dramatically in the 850s. In 850, for the first time, a Viking army wintered in England, establishing a base on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. In 854, another group wintered on the Isle of Sheppey in the Thames estuary. These winters spent on English soil represented a fundamental shift in Viking tactics. The Scandinavians were no longer returning home after each raiding season. They were preparing for prolonged operations and possibly permanent conquest. The Great Pangamer's army and the conquest of England, the year 865, marks a decisive turning point in the history of Viking wars. In that year, a coalition of Scandinavian warriors that would become known as the Great Heathen Army, or Myselhenhir in Old Anglo-Saxon, landed in East Anglia. Unlike previous expeditions, which primarily sought plunder, this army had a much more ambitious goal: the systematic conquest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Norse sagas attribute the leadership of the Great Heathen Army to the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar is a figure who inhabits the nebulous border between history and legend. Evidence of his actual existence is scarce, but crucial. Two references to a particularly eminent Viking raider in 840 appear in the generally reliable Anglo-Saxon chronicle, mentioning Ragnall and Reginhirus. Some sources identify Reginhirus as the leader of the devastating attack on Paris in 845. However, most of what we know about Ragnar comes from the Icelandic sagas composed centuries after his supposed life, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. What is historically more certain is the existence of his supposed sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Ivar the Boneless is often considered the principal leader of the Great Heathen Army, although his peculiar nickname has generated much speculation. Some theories suggest he suffered from a medical condition affecting his bones, such as osteogenesis imperfecta, while others interpret the epithet as a reference to exceptional flexibility or even extraordinary sexual potency. Regardless of the nickname's meaning, Ivar emerged as one of the most feared and successful commanders of his era. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, where its king, Edmund, apparently agreed to supply the Vikings with horses and provisions in exchange for temporary peace. Equipped with mounts that dramatically increased their mobility, the Vikings marched north in 866, advancing on Northumbria, then torn apart by a civil war between two claimants to the throne. On November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, the Vikings captured York, the principal city of northern England, known to the Romans as Eboracum and which would become Jorvik under Scandinavian rule. The two rival Northumbrian kings, Osbert and Aella, attempted a belated alliance against the invaders. In March 867, they launched an attack to retake York. The ensuing battle was disastrous for the Anglo-Saxons. Both kings were killed, and Northumbria fell permanently under Viking control. The Scandinavians installed an Anglo-Saxon puppet king named Egbert to rule in their name, transforming Northumbria into the nucleus of a new political entity that would come to be known as the Danelaw. The conquest of Northumbria demonstrated the effectiveness of Viking strategy. Instead of scattered raids, the Great Heathen Army attacked with concentrated force, exploiting the political divisions of its adversaries and systematically eliminating Anglo-Saxon power centers. After consolidating its control over the north, the army turned its attention to the south. In 869, the Great Heathen Army returned to East Anglia. King Edmund, who had supplied horses to the Vikings 4 years earlier, now attempted to resist. The resistance was futile. Edmund was captured and executed, possibly tied to a tree and killed with arrows before being beheaded. His brutal death transformed him into a Christian martyr, and he would later be venerated as Saint Edmund. East Anglia became yet another territory under Viking rule in 870. A new contingent known as the Great Summer Army arrived in England, led by a Viking chieftain named Bagsec and his 5 jarls. Joining forces with the Great Heathen Army, the Vikings prepared for what appeared to be the final blow: the conquest of Wessex, the last of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms still resisting. Wessex was ruled by King Athelred I, with his younger brother, Alfred, serving as his principal military commander. The year 871 would go down in history as the year of battles. The Vikings and the men of Wessex fought at least 9 pitched battles that year. In January, at the Battle of Ashdown, the Wessex forces achieved a significant victory. King Bagsec was killed along with his 5 jarls. According to tradition, it was the young Alfred who led the decisive charge while his brother was still completing his morning prayers. The victory at Ashdown was notable, but not decisive. The Vikings quickly regrouped and continued to press forward. In April 871, King Athelred I died, possibly from wounds received in battle. His brother Alfred ascended the throne of Wessex under desperate circumstances. The Vikings controlled most of England, and Wessex was exhausted from months of continuous fighting. Alfred pragmatically negotiated a truce, buying the temporary withdrawal of the Vikings. It was a precarious solution, but it allowed Wessex to survive to fight another day. During the following years, the Vikings concentrated their efforts on consolidating their gains in northern and eastern England. In 874, the Great Heathen Army split. Halfdan led a portion north to Northumbria, where he and his men would eventually settle as permanent colonists, receiving land and beginning to cultivate it. This transition from raiding warriors to settled farmers represented a fundamental shift in the character of the Viking presence in England. The other part of the army, under Guthrum's command, turned its attention to Wessex. In January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise attack against Alfred's court at Chippenham during the 12th day celebrations after Christmas, when the Anglo-Saxons were vulnerable and unprepared. The attack was devastatingly effective. Alfred was forced to flee with a small group of followers, taking refuge in the Somerset marshes, in the region known as Athelney. It was the lowest point of his reign and, apparently, the moment when the complete Viking conquest of England seemed imminent. The Battle of Edington and the division of England. Alfred's stay in the marshes of Athelney lasted only a few weeks, but it became one of the most legendary episodes in English history. It is during this period that the famous, though probably apocryphal, story of Alfred burning a peasant woman's cakes while absorbed in military concerns takes place. Legend or not, the period in Athelney represented a crucial moment of reorganization. Alfred was not simply hiding. He was gathering forces, sending messengers to loyal counties, and planning a counter-dash attack on May 878. Alfred emerged from his refuge. He summoned the FYRD, the local militias, from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The men of Wessex answered their king's call. In the week before Easter, Alfred gathered his forces at a place called Egbertstone, probably near Selwood Forest. From there, he marched to confront Guthrum's army, which was encamped at Chippenham. The two armies met at a place the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls Ethandun, identified by most historians as the present-day village of Edington in Wiltshire. The ensuing battle was one of the most decisive in English history. Alfred formed his army in a shield wall, the classic defensive formation of Anglo-Saxon warfare, and advanced against the Viking lines. The fighting was long and bloody, but eventually the Vikings gave way. Guthrum and his men fled to their stronghold at Chippenham, with the Anglo-Saxons in pursuit. Alfred besieged the Vikings at Chippenham for 2 weeks. With no hope of reinforcements and facing starvation, Guthrum was forced to negotiate. The terms of surrender, established in what became known as the Treaty of Wedmore, were surprisingly generous. Guthrum and 30 of his leading followers agreed to accept Christian baptism. Alfred himself served as Guthrum's godfather, and Guthrum received the Christian name Athelstan. This godparenthood created a symbolic bond between the two leaders, typical of medieval diplomatic practices. Most significantly, the subsequent negotiations, formalized in the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum around 886, divided England into two spheres of influence. The border roughly followed the course of the River Thames to its junction with the River Lea, then went up the Lea to its source, continued in a straight line to Bedford, and followed the River Ouse to Watling Street, the ancient Roman road that cut across England diagonally. The lands north and east of this line came under Viking control, forming the region that would become known as Danelaw, literally, the Law of the Danes. The lands to the south and west remained under Anglo-Saxon control, with Wessex as the dominant kingdom. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established not only territorial boundaries, but also regulations for peaceful trade and the value of weregild, the monetary compensation for murder or injury, which varied according to the victim's social status and whether they were Danish or English. This treaty represented a pragmatic recognition that the Vikings had come to stay. Total conquest was not possible for either side, so coexistence became the only viable alternative. The Vikings in France and the siege of Paris, while dramatic events unfolded in England. Another front of the Viking Wars was developing on the European continent. The Carolingian Empire, created by Charlemagne and divided among his grandsons after the death of Louis the Pious in 840, became an irresistible target for Scandinavian raiders. The navigable rivers of Francia, especially the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhone, offered routes of deep penetration into the heart of the empire. The first major recorded Viking raid on Francia occurred in 820, when 13 ships attempted to plunder the coast of Flanders but were repelled. Raids intensified in the following decades. In 841, Rouen was sacked. In 843, Nantes suffered a devastating attack on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, when the city was teeming with pilgrims and merchants. Bishop Gunhard was killed along with much of his congregation inside the cathedral itself. However, the event that most dramatically captured the imagination of the time was the First Siege of Paris in 845. A fleet of approximately 120 ships, under the command of a Viking chieftain named Reginhirus or Ragnar, sailed up the Seine in March of that year. Some later sources identify this Ragnar with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, although this connection is historically uncertain. The Frankish king Charles the Bald divided his army to defend the two banks of the Seine. The Vikings attacked the smaller force on the right bank, completely massacring them. Terrified, the defenders on the left bank fled without a fight. Paris in 845 was a city of enormous symbolic importance, although geographically compact, concentrated mainly on the Isle de la Cite, the island in the middle of the Seine. The Vikings arrived on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, amplifying the psychological impact of the attack. The city was sacked, and the invaders took both treasure and captives for enslavement. Charles the Bald, recognizing that he could not defeat the Vikings militarily, agreed to pay a tribute of 7,000 pounds of silver for their withdrawal. This was the first of the so-called Danegeld, tribute payments that would become a recurring feature of interactions between Christian kingdoms and Viking invaders. Danegeld's payments were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they offered temporary relief by buying off the invaders. On the other, they demonstrated weakness and ensured the Vikings would return for more. Indeed, Paris would be attacked repeatedly in the following decades, in 856, 857, 858, 861, 865, and 866. Each attack resulted in more destruction and more tribute payments. The largest and most famous siege of Paris took place between 885 and 886. A Viking fleet of unprecedented proportions, estimated at between 300 and 700 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, appeared on the Seine in November 885. The ensuing battle was one of the most decisive in English history. Alfred formed his army in a shield wall, the classic defensive formation of Anglo-Saxon warfare, and advanced against the Viking lines. The fighting was long and bloody, but eventually the Vikings gave way. Guthrum and his men fled to their stronghold at Chippenham, with the Anglo-Saxons in pursuit. Alfred besieged the Vikings at Chippenham for 2 weeks. With no hope of reinforcements and facing starvation, Guthrum was forced to negotiate. The terms of surrender, established in what became known as the Treaty of Wedmore, were surprisingly generous. Guthrum and 30 of his leading followers agreed to accept Christian baptism. Alfred himself served as Guthrum's godfather, and Guthrum received the Christian name Athelstan. This godparenthood created a symbolic bond between the two leaders, typical of medieval diplomatic practices. Most significantly, the subsequent negotiations, formalized in the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum around 886, divided England into two spheres of influence. The border roughly followed the course of the River Thames to its junction with the River Lea, then went up the Lea to its source, continued in a straight line to Bedford, and followed the River Ouse to Watling Street, the ancient Roman road that cut across England diagonally. The lands north and east of this line came under Viking control, forming the region that would become known as Danelaw, literally, the Law of the Danes. The lands to the south and west remained under Anglo-Saxon control, with Wessex as the dominant kingdom. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established not only territorial boundaries, but also regulations for peaceful trade and the value of wergild, the monetary compensation for murder or injury, which varied according to the victim's social status and whether they were Danish or English. This treaty represented a pragmatic recognition that the Vikings had come to stay. Total conquest was not possible for either side, so coexistence became the only viable alternative. The Vikings in France and the siege of Paris, while dramatic events unfolded in England. Another front of the Viking Wars was developing on the European continent. The Carolingian Empire, created by Charlemagne and divided among his grandsons after the death of Louis the Pious in 840, became an irresistible target for Scandinavian raiders. The navigable rivers of Francia, especially the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhone, offered routes of deep penetration into the heart of the empire. The first major recorded Viking raid on Francia occurred in 820, when 13 ships attempted to plunder the coast of Flanders but were repelled. Raids intensified in the following decades. In 841, Rouen was sacked. In 843, Nantes suffered a devastating attack on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, when the city was teeming with pilgrims and merchants. Bishop Gunhard was killed along with much of his congregation inside the cathedral itself. However, the event that most dramatically captured the imagination of the time was the First Siege of Paris in 845. A fleet of approximately 120 ships, under the command of a Viking chieftain named Reginhirus or Ragnar, sailed up the Seine in March of that year. Some later sources identify this Ragnar with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, although this connection is historically uncertain. The Frankish king Charles the Bald divided his army to defend the two banks of the Seine. The Vikings attacked the smaller force on the right bank, completely massacring them. Terrified, the defenders on the left bank fled without a fight. Paris in 845 was a city of enormous symbolic importance, although geographically compact, concentrated mainly on the Isle de la Cite, the island in the middle of the Seine. The Vikings arrived on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, amplifying the psychological impact of the attack. The city was sacked, and the invaders took both treasure and captives for enslavement. Charles the Bald, recognizing that he could not defeat the Vikings militarily, agreed to pay a tribute of 7,000 pounds of silver for their withdrawal. This was the first of the so-called Danegeld, tribute payments that would become a recurring feature of interactions between Christian kingdoms and Viking invaders. Danegeld's payments were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they offered temporary relief by buying off the invaders. On the other, they demonstrated weakness and ensured the Vikings would return for more. Indeed, Paris would be attacked repeatedly in the following decades, in 856, 857, 858, 861, 865, and 866. Each attack resulted in more destruction and more tribute payments. The largest and most famous siege of Paris took place between 885 and 886. A Viking fleet of unprecedented proportions, estimated at between 300 and 700 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, appeared on the Seine in November 885. The invaders were led by two chieftains, Sigfred and Rollo, although the identification of Rollo with the future founder of Normandy is debated by historians. This time, Paris was better prepared. Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin had fortified the bridges over the Seine, blocking the passage of the Viking fleet. When the Vikings demanded tribute to allow them to pass and plunder the lands upriver, the defenders of Paris refused. The ensuing siege would last almost a year. The Vikings launched multiple assaults on the fortifications of Paris, employing siege towers, battering rams, and even incendiary ships, but the defenders resisted tenaciously. Count Odo became a legendary hero for his leadership during the siege, personally participating in the combat and performing feats of bravery that would be celebrated in songs and chronicles. Bishop Goslin, despite his advanced age, also actively participated in the defense, dying during the siege, possibly from illness. Emperor Charles the Fat eventually arrived with a large relief army, but instead of attacking the Vikings, he negotiated a shameful diplomatic solution. He allowed the Vikings to sail up the Seine to plunder Burgundy, which had rebelled against him, and paid them additional tribute. This decision destroyed Charles's prestige, and he would be deposed in 887, dying soon after. The heroic resistance of Paris, in contrast to imperial cowardice, established the reputation of the dynasty of the Counts of Paris, who would eventually replace the Carolingians as kings of Francia. Viking raids on Francia continued in the following decades, but the nature of the threat was changing. Increasingly, Viking groups sought not only plunder but also land for permanent settlement. This trend culminated in 911 when the Frankish King Charles the Simple negotiated the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte with the Viking chieftain Rollo. By this treaty, Rollo received lands around the mouth of the Seine, including the city of Rouen, in exchange for swearing allegiance to the Frankish king, converting to Christianity, and defending the region against other Viking invaders. This was the birth of Normandy, the land of the Northerners, a duchy that would become one of the most formidable powers in medieval Europe. The Anglo-Saxon reconquest and the establishment of the DNLW while Normandy was emerging in Francia. Equally significant developments were taking place in England. Alfred the Great, who had survived the crisis of 878, dedicated the following years of his reign to preparing Wessex to withstand future Viking invasions. His approach was systematic and innovative, encompassing military, administrative, and cultural reforms that would fundamentally transform the Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the military field. Alfred created a network of buzz, strategically positioned fortresses that served as centers of defense and refuge for civilian populations during Viking raids. Each BA was garrisoned by men recruited from the surrounding areas, creating a permanent defense network that could respond quickly to enemy incursions. Alfred also reformed the FYRD, the military recruitment system, dividing eligible men into two groups that rotated service, ensuring that there were always forces available while the other half tended to the crops. Furthermore, he built a fleet of warships larger and more stable than the Viking ships, hoping to intercept invaders before they landed. These reforms were tested between 892 and 896, when a new and large Viking armada, defeated in Francia, crossed the English Channel and invaded England. Unlike previous invasions, the Vikings encountered coordinated and effective resistance. The network of buzz prevented the invaders from establishing permanent settlements, and Alfred's forces managed to keep the Vikings constantly on the move, denying them the bases necessary for a prolonged campaign. After 4 years of inconclusive fighting, the Vikings gave up. Some left for other places. Others settled peacefully in the Danelaw. It was a victory of attrition, not a dramatic military triumph, but it demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxons had learned to fight the Vikings on their own terms. Alfred died in 899, but his work continued under his successors. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, launched a systematic campaign to reconquer the Danelaw. The strategy was methodical, advance gradually, build buzz to consolidate gains, and only then proceed to the next phase. Edward operated in the south, while Ethelflaed conducted operations in the north and west. This coordination between siblings proved devastatingly effective. In 917, the combined forces of Wessex and Mercia achieved a series of decisive victories. The small Viking states of the Danelaw, lacking the unity needed to withstand sustained pressure, capitulated one after another. Important cities such as Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham submitted to Anglo-Saxon rule. When Edward died in 924, only the Viking kingdom of York in the far north remained independent. The Kingdom of York, or Jorvik as it was known to the Scandinavians, proved to be a more resilient adversary. Its history in the following decades was tumultuous, marked by conflicts between different Viking factions, including rival dynasties from Ireland and Scandinavia. On several occasions, Anglo-Saxon kings managed to impose their rule over York, only to see it escape again. In 947, Eric Bloodaxe, a notoriously violent Norwegian prince, captured York and established himself as its last independent Viking king. The reign of Eric Bloodaxe in York was brief and turbulent. In 954, he was expelled and killed, possibly in an ambush at Stainmoor. With his death, the last independent Viking kingdom in England came to an end. The Anglo-Saxon King Eadred, grandson of Alfred the Great, definitively incorporated Northumbria into the unified English kingdom. It was the culmination of almost a century of struggle, beginning with Alfred's victory at Edington and continued by his descendants. The Anglo-Saxons had triumphed, but victory did not mean the elimination of the Scandinavian presence. The descendants of the Viking settlers remained, gradually integrating into Anglo-Saxon society while leaving indelible marks on the language, law, place names, and social structures of the regions where they had settled. Viking influence in the Danelaw was visible in multiple aspects of daily life. The administrative structure was reorganized according to Scandinavian patterns, with the division into districts called wapentakes instead of the traditional Anglo-Saxon hundredos. The toponymy of the region was transformed, with hundreds of localities receiving names of Norse origin ending in by farm, thorp, village, thwaite, clearing, and toft, building plot. Words from Old Norse were incorporated into English, including everyday terms that remain in use to this day, such as sky, window, husband, law, and even the pronoun they. The Vikings in the east, two Varangians to the Russ of Kiev, while the Danes and Norwegians ravaged the western lands. The Swedish Scandinavians, known as Varangians, moved eastward. Their expansion followed the river routes that cut across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These warrior merchants established trading posts, founding political entities that would leave a lasting legacy in the history of Russia and Eastern Europe. The Varangians appeared in the Eastern Baltic around the middle of the 8th century. Attracted by trade opportunities with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, they established outposts along the river routes. The Volga River offered access to the Caspian Sea and Muslim markets, while the Dnieper led to the Black Sea and the fabulous Constantinople, known to the Norse as Miklagard, the Great City. The Russian Primary Chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century, offers a legendary account of the founding of the first Russian state. According to this chronicle, around 862, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region, weary of their internal disputes, sent a delegation to the Varangians asking them to come and govern them. "Our land is large and rich," they are said to have stated, "but there is no order in it. Come and govern us." In response, 3 Varangian brothers, Rurik, Cineas, and Truver, accepted the invitation and settled in the region. Rurik settled in Novgorod, or Holmgard as the Norse called it, and founded the dynasty that would rule Russia for over 700 years, until the death of Tsar Fifer I in 1598. The name Rus, from which the terms Russia and Russian are derived, likely originates from a Norse word meaning rowers or men who row, reflecting the crucial importance of river navigation to these Scandinavian settlers. After Rurik's death in 879, his relative Oleg assumed power as regent for the young heir Igor. Oleg proved to be an ambitious and capable leader. In 882, according to tradition, he captured Kiev, a strategically located city on the banks of the Dnieper River, and transferred the center of his power there. Kiev became the capital of what historians call Kievan Rus, a state that would eventually extend from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Oleg and his successors established complex relations with the Byzantine Empire. In 860, even before the founding of Kievan Rus, a Varangian fleet had attacked Constantinople, albeit unsuccessfully. Subsequent attacks occurred in 907, 941, and 944. These campaigns, while not resulting in permanent conquests, demonstrated the military strength of the Varangians and led to favorable trade treaties that guaranteed Rus merchants privileged access to the markets of Constantinople. The relationship between the Varangians and Byzantium eventually evolved from conflict to military cooperation. Around 988, Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus sent 6,000 Varangian warriors to assist the Byzantine Emperor Basil II in suppressing a dangerous internal rebellion. In return, Vladimir received the hand of the emperor's sister in marriage, an extraordinary privilege that reflected the value Byzantium placed on the alliance with Rus. These Varangian warriors formed the core of what would become the celebrated Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army that served as personal bodyguards to the emperors for over 2 centuries. The Varangian Guard became famous for its ferocity in combat and its unwavering loyalty to the emperors they served. Their loyalty was to the emperors personally, not to the Byzantine state or court factions, making them ideal guards in a notoriously treacherous political environment. The most famous member of the Varangian Guard was Harald Hardrada, who served in the Guard during the 1030s and 1040s before returning to Scandinavia to claim the Norwegian throne. During his time in Byzantium, Harald participated in campaigns in Sicily, the Eastern Mediterranean, and possibly Jerusalem. The wealth he amassed in the emperor's service financed his subsequent career as a conqueror. Decades later, Harald would return to the history of the British Isles in a dramatic way. As we shall see later, the Battle of Clontarf and the Vikings in Ireland while events unfolded in England and the East, the Vikings in Ireland faced their own turning point. For over 2 centuries, Viking settlements in Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Wexford, and Cork had become thriving centers of trade and military power. The Norsemen had partially integrated into Irish society, forming marriage alliances with local royal families and participating in the incessant disputes between Irish kings. The rise of Brian Boru fundamentally altered this balance. Brian, born around 941 as a member of the Dalkais dynasty in what is now County Clare, emerged from relatively modest origins to become the most powerful man in Ireland. Through a combination of ruthless warfare and shrewd diplomacy, Brian expanded his dominion from his native kingdom of Thomond to encompass the entire province of Munster. He then challenged the traditional supremacy of the Ui Neil in Northern Ireland. In 1002, Brian was recognized as High King of Ireland, the first man in centuries to genuinely claim such a title with any real substance. His power, however, was not uncontested. King Mael Morda of Leinster in Eastern Ireland and the Vikings of Dublin, under their king Sihtric Silkenbeard, refused to accept Brian's hegemony. The tension between these forces would eventually explode into what would become one of the bloodiest battles in medieval Irish history. On Good Friday of 1014, specifically on April 23rd, the 2 armies met at Clontarf on the outskirts of Dublin. On one side was the vast army of Brian Boru, composed of warriors from Munster, Connaught, and parts of Meath and Ulster. On the other side was a coalition of forces from Leinster, Vikings from Dublin, and Norse warriors from overseas, including contingents from the Orkney Islands, the Isle of Man, and possibly Norway. Estimates of the size of the armies vary widely in medieval sources, with some accounts enormously inflating the numbers. Modern estimates suggest that each side may have mustered between 4,000 and 7,000 warriors, which by Irish standards of the time represented exceptionally large forces. Brian Boru, then around 73 years old, did not personally command on the battlefield, remaining in his camp while his sons and generals led the troops. The battle was extraordinarily bloody and prolonged, lasting from dawn until dusk. Both sides suffered devastating losses. Brian's men eventually prevailed, breaking through enemy lines and forcing the survivors to flee. Many Vikings, attempting to reach their ships anchored in the bay, drowned as the tide rose. The victory, however, came at a terrible cost. Brian Boru was killed in his camp during or immediately after the battle. According to tradition, a fugitive Viking named Broder located the elderly king's tent and murdered him. Brian's son, Murchid, also died fighting, as did his grandson Twardelbach. On the opposing side, King Mael Morda of Leinster was killed, as was Jarl Sigurd of Orkney and many other leaders. The Battle of Clontarf is often described as the end of Viking power in Ireland, but this characterization requires qualification. The Vikings of Dublin were not exterminated or expelled. Sihtric Silkenbeard, who prudently remained within the walls of Dublin during the battle, continued to rule over the city for another 2 decades. Viking settlements in Waterford, Limerick, and elsewhere also survived. What Clontarf effectively ended was the possibility of a unified Ireland under Viking or Hiberno-Norse rule. Brian Boru's death also prevented the consolidation of his own power. Without his leadership, the dream of a unified Ireland faded. Irish kings returned to their traditional disputes, and the Norse, though weakened, continued as a significant presence in Irish coastal towns until the arrival of the Normans in the 12th century. When Strongbow's Norman-Irish forces captured Dublin in 1171, they found a Scandinavian community that, although Christianized and partially assimilated, still maintained its distinctive identity. The return of the Vikings to England and the North Sea Empire in the late 10th and early 11th centuries saw a dramatic resurgence of Viking raids into England. After decades of relative peace, a new wave of Scandinavian attacks began in 980, initiating a turbulent period that would culminate in the complete conquest of England by a Danish dynasty. The English king during this period was Athelred II, known by his pejorative epithet, the unready or the ill-advised. Athelred, who ascended the throne as a child in 978 after the assassination of his half-brother Edward, proved to be an ineffective ruler, unable to organize a coherent resistance against the Viking invaders. His main strategy was the payment of tribute, the so-called Danegelds, which, although providing temporary relief, encouraged increasingly larger raids. In 991, a Viking fleet under Olaf Tryggvason defeated Anglo-Saxon forces at the Battle of Malden in Essex. Caldorman Bertnoth, leader of the Essex forces, was killed in the battle, which would later be immortalized in one of the most celebrated epic poems of Old English. After the victory, Athelred paid 10,000 pounds of silver for the Vikings to withdraw. It was only the beginning. Tax payments escalated dramatically in the following decades. 16,000 pounds in 994, 24,000 pounds in 1002, 36,000 pounds in 1007, 48,000 pounds in 1012. These astronomical sums represented a massive transfer of wealth from England to Scandinavia and imposed an overwhelming burden on the English population. In November 1002, Athelred ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. On November 13th, the feast day of St. Brice, Danes residing in England were attacked and killed on royal orders. Ethelred's exact motivations remain debated, but the massacre apparently targeted Danes who had settled peacefully in England, not Viking invaders. Among the dead was Gunhild, sister of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. If the massacre was intended to intimidate the Danes, it had the opposite effect. Sweyn Forkbeard initiated a series of punitive expeditions against England, culminating in a full-scale invasion in 1013. Facing minimal resistance, Sweyn conquered England in a matter of months. Athelred fled to Normandy, seeking refuge with his Norman relatives, and Sweyn was proclaimed King of England in December 1013. Sweyn's reign over England lasted only 5 weeks. On February 3, 1014, he died suddenly, possibly from an accident or illness. His death triggered a succession crisis. The Danes in England proclaimed his son Nut as king, while the Anglo-Saxon nobles invited Athelred to return from exile. Nut was forced to retreat to Denmark to gather forces, while Athelred reclaimed the English throne. Athelred died in April 1016, leaving his son Edmund, known as Ironside for his ferocity in battle, to face the return of Nut. The two young kings fought a series of fierce battles throughout 1016, with Edmund achieving some impressive victories. However, at the Battle of Asandin in October 1016, Nut's forces won a decisive victory. The two kings subsequently negotiated, dividing England between themselves, with Nut controlling the north and Edmund the south. Edmund died in November 1016, just weeks after the agreement. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, with some sources suggesting assassination. Regardless of the cause, his death left Nut as the sole king of all England. It was the culmination of the process begun with the raids of 980. England had been completely conquered by a Viking king. Nut, however, was not simply a foreign conqueror. He strove to be recognized as a legitimate ruler by the Anglo-Saxons. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Athelred, symbolically uniting the conquering dynasty with the Normans and the previous Anglo-Saxon royalty. He maintained many of the Anglo-Saxon administrative structures and generously promoted the Christian Church. His reign was characterized by relative peace and prosperity. Nut eventually amassed an empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. This North Sea Empire represented the height of medieval Scandinavian power, a thalassocracy that dominated the trade routes of Northern Europe. Nut was one of the most powerful kings in Christendom, received with honors by the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope in Rome. The famous story of Nut attempting to command the tides of the sea, often misinterpreted as an example of royal arrogance, was in fact, according to the original sources, a demonstration of humility. Nut is said to have ordered the waves to stop precisely to demonstrate to his sycophantic courtiers that even the most powerful of earthly kings was powerless before the forces of nature and God. Nut died in 1035, leaving his vast empire to his sons. However, the dynasty he founded would not last. Harald Harefoot, one of his sons, ruled briefly, followed by Harthacnut, another son, who died without heirs in 1042. With Harthacnut's death, Nut's male line became extinct, and the English nobles invited Edward the Confessor, son of Athelred and Emma, to return from exile in Normandy to assume the throne. The Anglo-Saxon dynasty was restored, but the events that followed in 1066 would demonstrate that the era of Scandinavian invasions was not yet completely over. 1066. The year of the three battles and the end of the Viking Age. The year 1066 is one of the most famous in English history, simultaneously marking the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the definitive end of the Viking Age in the British Isles. In that single year, 3 monumental battles would decide the nation's fate, involving 3 kings and 3 armies with distinct warrior traditions. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 without leaving direct heirs. The succession was disputed by multiple claimants. Harold Godwin's son, powerful Earl of Wessex and brother-in-law of the deceased king, was chosen by the Anglo-Saxon nobility and crowned on January 6th, the same day as Edward's funeral. However, others claimed the throne. William, Duke of Normandy, alleged that Edward had promised him the crown and that Harold himself had sworn to support him. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, based his claim on an alleged agreement between his predecessors and the Danish kings of England. Harald Hardrada was one of the most extraordinary figures of his time. Born in 1015, he was the half-brother of Olaf II, the Norwegian king who would later be venerated as a saint. After Olaf's death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, young Harald fled into exile, embarking on an adventurous career that would take him to the ends of the known world. He served in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium, accumulating wealth and military experience in campaigns throughout Sicily, Bulgaria, and the East. He returned to Scandinavia in the 1040s, eventually becoming King of Norway and gaining a reputation as a ruthless warrior and ambitious ruler. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada launched his invasion. With a fleet estimated at between 200 and 300 ships, carrying perhaps 9,000 warriors, the Norwegian king sailed first to Orkney, where he received reinforcements, and then to northern England. He was supported by Tostig, the exiled brother of Harold Godwin's son, who harbored bitter resentment against his brother. The invaders defeated the forces of the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia at Fulford, on the outskirts of York, on September 20th. The Earls survived, but their forces were decimated. York opened its gates to the Norwegians, and Harald Hardrada camped at Stamford Bridge, east of the city, while awaiting the delivery of hostages and provisions. The Vikings were confident. They believed that English resistance in the north had been eliminated. Harold Godwin's son moved with extraordinary speed. Gathering his forces in London, he marched north at a speed that surprised everyone, covering approximately 300 kilometers in just 4 days. On September 25th, without any prior warning, the English army appeared near Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians were caught completely by surprise. Many had left their chainmail on the ships, anchored miles away, due to the unusual heat of that September. The ensuing battle was one of the bloodiest of the Viking Age. According to tradition, a single Viking warrior held the bridge over the Derwent River for a considerable time, slaughtering numerous Englishmen until he was killed by a soldier who crept under the bridge and struck him from below. When the Norwegians finally formed their battle lines, Harald Hardrada was killed prematurely, struck in the neck by an arrow. Tostig took command, but he too was killed shortly afterwards. Without his leadership, the Norwegian resistance crumbled. The survivors fled to their ships. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invading army, only 24 were needed to transport the survivors back to Norway. The Battle of Stamford Bridge is traditionally considered the end of the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was dead. Never again would a Scandinavian fleet attempt to conquer England. The Norwegians would make smaller incursions again in the future, but the era of great invasions was over. For Harold Godwin's son, however, there was no time to celebrate. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, he received devastating news. William of Normandy had landed in southern England with a large army. Harold immediately marched south, covering an even greater distance in even less time. On October 14th, just 19 days after Stamford Bridge, the two armies met at Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was decided against the English. Harold Godwin's son was killed, possibly by an arrow to the eye according to popular tradition, although the sources are uncertain. His death signified the end of Anglo-Saxon England. William the Conqueror would be crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066, inaugurating a new era in English history. Legacy and consequences of the Viking Wars. The Viking Wars, which spanned nearly 3 centuries, left indelible marks on European history. Their impact was multifaceted, encompassing political, social, economic, and cultural transformations that shaped the continent's development for generations. In the political field, the era of Viking invasions accelerated processes of centralization and state formation throughout Europe. In England, the Viking threat was the catalyst that allowed the creation of a unified kingdom. Alfred the Great and his descendants consolidated their authority precisely because they offered protection against the Scandinavian invaders. The same pattern was repeated in France, where the need for defense against the Vikings strengthened local power structures, preparing the ground for the emergence of regional powers such as Normandy. Scandinavia itself was transformed by the Viking Age. Contacts with Christian Europe and the Byzantine and Islamic East introduced new ideas, technologies, and forms of political organization. The small kingdoms and tribal chiefdoms of the early Viking Age gradually gave way to centralized kingdoms under Christian dynasties. Denmark was unified under the Jelling dynasty. Norway, despite its geographical divisions, emerged as a coherent kingdom, and Sweden gradually consolidated from multiple centers of power. Conversion to Christianity, though initially resisted, eventually integrated the Scandinavian countries into the community of European nations. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vikings is Normandy and its descendants. The Normans, descendants of the Vikings who settled in Francia under Rollo, became one of the most dynamic forces of the Middle Ages. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 fundamentally transformed English culture, language, and institutions. The Normans also established kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy, led crusades, and left their architectural mark on cathedrals and castles throughout Europe. In the English language, the influence of Old Norse is particularly evident. Hundreds of everyday words, from sky and window to they, their, and them, derive from contact between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. The grammatical structure of English was also simplified during the contact period, possibly as a result of the need for communication between speakers of related but distinct languages. Place names throughout northern and eastern England attest to the Scandinavian presence, with their characteristic endings in by, Thorpe, Thwaite, and Toft. In Russia, the Varangian legacy is equally significant. The Rurikid dynasty, founded by the Varangian Rurik, ruled Russia for over 700 years, first as princes of Kievan Rus, then as Grand Dukes of Moscow, and finally as Tsars of all the Russias. The very name Russia derives from the Rus, the Swedish Varangians who established the first East Slavic states. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium endured until the Fourth Crusade in 1204, serving as a cultural bridge between the Germanic North and the Eastern Mediterranean world. The Viking Wars also had profound consequences for the church and Christian culture. Although early attacks on monasteries resulted in terrible destruction of manuscripts, relics, and works of art, in the long term, the Viking threat spurred reforms in the church and the defense of religious centers. Many monasteries were relocated inland or fortified. The need to preserve sacred texts led to renewed efforts at copying and preservation. Ironically, some of the most valuable medieval manuscripts survived precisely because they were hidden or moved due to the Viking threat. The gradual conversion of Scandinavians to Christianity also expanded the reach of the church. By the end of the Viking Age, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were Christian kingdoms, with dioceses, monasteries, and churches that integrated Scandinavia into Latin Christendom. The Vikings, who had begun as the scourge of Christendom, ended up as some of its most devout members. Knut the Great, the Viking king who conquered England, was one of the most generous monarchs to the church of his time. Founding churches and monasteries and making pilgrimages to Rome in the economic sphere, the Vikings were simultaneously destroyers and creators. Their raids disrupted existing trade networks and devastated productive communities. However, the Vikings were also avid traders. Their trade routes connected Scandinavia to Russia, Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, and Western Europe. Cities founded or developed by the Vikings, such as Dublin, York, and Novgorod, became important trading centers that would survive for centuries. Arab silver flowing through the Varangian routes stimulated the economy of Northern Europe, while Viking trading centers served as connecting points between different economic zones. The memory of the Viking Wars persisted through the centuries in the form of sagas, chronicles, and legends. The Icelandic sagas, composed mainly in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserved oral traditions about the Viking Age, albeit mixed with legendary and literary elements. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok, whether real or not, captured the popular imagination and continue to fascinate to this day. Anglo-Saxon, Irish, and Frankish chronicles documented the attacks from the victim's perspective, creating the image of the Vikings as bloodthirsty barbarians that dominated popular perception for centuries. Modern historiography has worked to balance this view. Contemporary scholars recognize that the Vikings were a complex society, capable of both extreme violence and remarkable cultural sophistication. Their art, particularly goldsmithing and wood carving, demonstrates refined artistic skill. Their poetry, preserved in the Eddas, is among the most powerful in medieval literature. Their naval technology was the most advanced of their time, and their explorations took them to places no European had visited before, including the coasts of North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The Viking Wars were ultimately a period of traumatic yet creative transformation. The violence and destruction were real and terrible, but from the chaos emerged a different Europe, in which political borders, social structures, and trade connections had been fundamentally reorganized. The descendants of the conquering Vikings became the rulers of Normandy, Norman England, Norman Sicily, and Russia. Their contribution to the formation of medieval Europe was indelible. CONCLUSION, and so we come to the end of this epic journey through the Viking Wars. For nearly 3 centuries, the warriors of the North shaped the destiny of Europe, destroying kingdoms and founding new ones, sacking cities and establishing trade routes that connected distant worlds. From Lindisfarne to Stamford Bridge, from Paris to Constantinople, from Dublin to Novgorod, the Vikings left their indelible mark on history. These men and women of the North were not simply bloodthirsty barbarians or romantic heroes. They were complex human beings, products of a specific society, responding to particular economic, political, and social pressures. Their raids caused untold suffering, but their contributions to the formation of medieval Europe were equally significant. The England that emerged from the Viking Wars was more unified than before. The France that withstood the sieges of Paris eventually became one of the dominant powers in Europe, and Russia owes its very existence to the dynasties founded by the Varangians. The Viking Age officially ended in 1066 with the death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. However, their legacy lives on in the language we speak, the names of the places we inhabit, the institutions that govern us, and the stories we tell. The Vikings were the last great pagan invaders of Europe, and their defeat and assimilation marked the definitive triumph of medieval Christendom. But this triumph was not a victory over the Scandinavians. It was their incorporation into the fabric of European civilization. If you've made it this far, it means you share our passion for history and knowledge of the past. This content was produced with academic rigor and absolute respect for historical facts, intended to serve as study material and reference for students, researchers, and history enthusiasts. I ask that you subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the great moments in world history. Share this video with friends, colleagues, and teachers who could benefit from this educational material. Together, we can spread quality historical knowledge to more and more people. History is the collective memory of humanity, and knowing it is understanding who we are and how we got here. We will continue to produce in-depth content about the events and characters that shaped our world. Until the next journey through time.